It is at night that the soul cries out loudest, when the medicines no longer work, when the body rests, but the heart finds no rest. You know this feeling. Your eyes open in the dark, your mind reliving old pains, and an anguish that has no name. But what if I told you that there is a place where this pain can be heard, that there is a promise from God that works even while you sleep? It is not a myth, nor is it empty consolation. It is the living word, revealed in a psalm that carries the ability to heal wounds that medicine cannot reach. This promise requires no effort or theological understanding. It only asks that you listen, that you remain. Because while the world is silent, God speaks. And when He speaks, something begins to change inside and out. Stay with me until the end, because in this video, what will be released may touch exactly what most needs to be restored in you. The healing has already begun. It only needs one space, your heart. It was 1 in the morning when the sound of the clock became louder than her own thoughts. The house was silent, but inside that room, a whirlwind of anguish was forming. Lying in bed, with her eyes open and her body exhausted, a woman stared at the dark ceiling while her mind insisted on revisiting old worries and recent pains. Nothing physical hurt at that moment, and yet she felt as if she carried a weight on her shoulders that no position could alleviate. There was no fever, there was no cut, but the restlessness was real, almost palpable. Next to the bed, a closed Bible seemed like just another forgotten object. She had always believed, but at that moment, everything seemed distant, even God. What happens inside us when night falls and the silence accentuates what we try to hide during the day? Why do certain sufferings intensify precisely when everything slows down? Science states that when night falls, the brain activates emotional circuits linked to memory and reflection. It is no coincidence that so many people report anxiety attacks precisely at times that should be the most peaceful. But there is also another layer of reality that science does not always accurately reach, that of the spirit. The inner dimension where words do not reach, but where everything vibrates with intensity. It is in this invisible space that the soul silently asks for help. For centuries, men and women have recognized this intimate battlefield. They did not call it anxiety or emotional distress, but they knew that the heart also gets sick, that the soul can lose strength. And, even without modern explanations, they found solace in something that has crossed generations. Ancient words, written in times of war, desert, loss, and loneliness. These words were not formulated by academic theologians or philosophers with time to spare, but by people in crisis who were bleeding inside and found relief when they spoke to God. These texts became known as Psalms. The curious thing is that, although they are available to millions of people, the Psalms are often seen as nothing more than religious poetry. Some people read them only in formal ceremonies, in pages that are consulted sporadically. But for those who truly suffer, for those who experience nights like that of the woman lying motionless in bed, they can become much more than a collection of pretty verses. The Psalms are sincere records of pain, supplication, courage, and hope. They do not hide human frailty, but place it before God without masks. King David, one of the main authors of these compositions, lived through persecution, betrayal, guilt, and mourning. He knew the euphoria of victory, but he also plunged into deep emotional abysses. His psalms were not written in the tranquility of a palace, but often in the hiding place of caves, surrounded by enemies, or in tears over the mourning of a son. That is precisely why his words still speak so powerfully. Because they come from someone who knew firsthand what it was like to cry until one had no more strength. But the beauty of the Psalms lies precisely in the contrast between suffering and trust. Each lament turns into prayer, each pain is sown as a seed of faith. It is as if, by naming their feelings before God, the authors of these texts freed themselves from the weight they were carrying. Instead of denying their pain, they surrendered it, transforming it into a point of contact with the divine. This practice, simple and profound, is what many rediscover when they begin to read a psalm with sincerity. It is not a magic formula, but a dive into one's own soul, accompanied by listening to a God who cares. That woman, that morning, didn't know any of this yet. His Bible remained closed, and his thoughts spun in circles with no way out. But what she would later discover, and what thousands of others have already discovered, is that you don't always have to talk a lot to be heard. Sometimes it all starts with just a few words, a verse, a whisper, a distant reminder that there is a resting place not just for the body, but for the spirit. And that place, for many, has been found between the lines of the Psalms. It is at this point that faith begins to restore what time, fear, or pain have tried to break. Behind what we call tiredness, there is often something deeper than bodily exhaustion. There is a type of wear and tear that cannot be resolved with physical rest or painkillers. It is the type of suffering that escapes medical examinations and that many cannot even describe accurately. These are the invisible pains, those that live inside people, fueled by traumas, pressures, loneliness and anguish that accumulate without warning. For a long time, this type of pain has been neglected. But in recent years, it has become a central topic in public health debates around the world. In 2019, the World Health Organization reported that more than 320 million people suffered from depression worldwide. This number grew in the following years, especially after the critical period of the pandemic. Social isolation, emotional loss, and economic instability worsened the emotional suffering of millions of individuals. In Brazil, data from the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation revealed that, in 2022, almost 60% of the adult population reported symptoms such as anxiety, insomnia, and feelings of mental exhaustion. These numbers demonstrate a reality that is no longer an exception. Emotional pain has sickened entire families, and the most alarming thing is that, most of the time, this pain is neither visible nor verbalized. People continue to go about their daily lives, carry out their duties, and smile in public, while something inside them is falling apart. In these cases, professional help is essential, but there is also a dimension of pain that escapes even conventional therapeutic resources. It is the spiritual dimension of suffering, which touches areas of existence that only faith can reach. The Psalms are born from this space. They are not just beautiful texts, but authentic records of the human condition in the face of its vulnerability. They speak of deep feelings with an honesty that is often lacking in our own prayers. Those who read a psalm realize that they are not alone, that there are others who have felt fear, guilt, despair, anguish, and yet have turned to God in the face of all this. What makes these words so powerful is not the perfection of the language, but the truth contained within them. Unlike many religious discourses that demand strength all the time, the Psalms welcome weakness without judgment. In 2021, researchers at Duke University in the United States published a study demonstrating that regular spiritual practices, such as reading sacred texts, were associated with a reduction in symptoms of mild and moderate depression. Another study from the University of São Paulo, conducted in the same year, showed that people with regular religious habits had more stable levels of cortisol, a hormone directly linked to stress. This does not mean that spirituality eliminates the need for medical care, but it does show that it has a real impact on the way the body and mind react to external pressures. It is at this point that the Psalms acquire even greater relevance. They do not offer emotional escapism, but a concrete way to deal with suffering through a living relationship with God. It's not about denying the pain, it's about finding a way through it. By reading, meditating, and praying based on these texts, one not only connects with the faith tradition, but reconfigures one's perception of reality. The suffering is still present, but it stops being an endless abyss and becomes a terrain where something can be built, even if little by little. Many who approach the Psalms for the first time are surprised by the direct tone of some passages. There are questions thrown fearlessly to heaven, confessions of deep discouragement, pleas for justice, supplications for healing, and even expressions of anger. This type of language is a relief to those who feel they need to restrain themselves even before God. The Psalms teach that faith does not require disguise. On the contrary, it begins precisely when we are able to present ourselves before God with all that we are, without filters. In biblical accounts, there is no shortage of moments when central figures of faith go through emotional breakdowns. Elijah, the prophet who faced kings and false gods, asked for death in the middle of the desert. Job cursed the day of his birth. Jeremiah wept before the destruction of his city. But what they all have in common is that, even at the height of their suffering, they maintained their connection with God. And it is this thread of connection, often sustained only by a word or a murmured prayer, that gives meaning to the use of the Psalms as a tool for caring for the soul. By choosing one of these ancient prayers to read in a moment of distress, the individual accesses not only a message, but a state of listening to oneself, listening to God, listening to what needs to be healed, what has been repressed, what can still flourish. This is why the Psalms are not formulas, but bridges that connect the human to the divine, the present to the eternal, chaos to the possibility of peace. They do not promise that suffering will end immediately, but they offer a place where it can be welcomed and transformed. If someone asks what the Psalms have to do with emotional health, the answer lies precisely in this ability to name what is often hidden. They give voice to the suffering soul, recognize fragility as a legitimate part of existence, and show that, even in the darkest days, it is still possible to find comfort in words that have crossed centuries and remain alive. The relevance of the Psalms lies not only in the beauty of their composition or the depth of their words. Their true power comes from the story behind each line. They are texts born from the reality experienced by men who faced conflicts, losses, fears, and crises that challenged their human limits. When we understand who these authors were and in what contexts they wrote, the impact of these words becomes even more significant. They are not idealized speeches, but records of real experiences marked by pain and faith. David is without doubt the name most associated with the Psalms. Of the 150 Psalms that make up the book, at least 73 are attributed to him. But who was this man who became a symbol of devotion, courage, and vulnerability before God? Long before he became king, David was just a young shepherd, forgotten by his own family. His name was ignored when the prophet Samuel was looking for the future king among the sons of Jesse. The divine choice fell on someone who did not occupy any prominent position, which already signals a recurring principle in the scriptures. God sees what human eyes do not perceive. David's life was marked by extreme moments. After being anointed, he faced physical and emotional battles. He was persecuted by King Saul, who wanted to kill him out of envy and fear. David spent years in hiding, living in caves and deserts, in constant fear of being captured. Despite divine promises about his future, he was exposed to situations of abandonment, distrust, and betrayal. David's soul was often torn apart by pressures that would have destroyed anyone. It is precisely in this scenario of adversity that many of the Psalms were written. When he says that his heart is in anguish or that his bones are shaking, he is not speaking symbolically. He is recounting experiences of deep despair. The language he uses is visceral, unfiltered, revealing a man who understands what it is like to live in constant tension between what God has promised and what reality seems to deny. Yet, even in the moments of greatest affliction, David does not break with his faith. He cries out, questions, exposes himself, but remains in dialogue with the God he has chosen to trust. In addition to David, other names contributed to the Psalms. One of them was Asaph, a Levite responsible for the music in the temple. The Psalms attributed to him have a striking characteristic. They address the crisis of faith in the face of the apparent injustice of the world. In one of his texts, Asaph confesses that he almost lost confidence when he saw the success of the wicked while the righteous suffered. The honesty of this reflection brings his testimony closer to many who today wonder why bad things happen to people who seek to live righteously. The answer that Asaph finds does not come from logical explanations, but from the presence of God. Upon entering the sanctuary, he redirects his vision and understands that divine justice is not limited to the immediate. Another important group in the authorship of the Psalms are the sons of Korah. Descendants of a lineage marked by rebellion, they transformed their history by becoming musicians and poets dedicated to praise. Their psalms speak of confidence in the midst of instability, of hope in the midst of failure. One of the most profound texts about longing for God is theirs. As the deer pants for water, so my soul thirsts for the Lord. It is a cry from someone who feels far from the divine presence, but who does not give up searching for it. If this message has made sense to you so far, write Amen in the comments. It's a simple way to show that you're on this journey and want to continue with this purpose. Each author of the Psalms brought with him not only his personal experience, but also the collective context of a people who faced wars, exile, disease, and humiliation. Israel was not an invincible nation. Throughout history, it was dominated by empires, lost its land, was deported, rebuilt, divided. And in each of these phases, the Psalms were formed as a spiritual response to the tragedies experienced. This explains why so many of these prayers speak of refuge, help, deliverance, and restoration. They are the reflection of a collective memory that learned to transform pain into cry and loss into trust. What makes the Psalms restorative, then, is the process they represent. They are born from pain, cross doubt, and lead to hope. They do not deny reality, but interpret it in the light of a living relationship with God. And this emotional and spiritual journey also becomes a tool for the reader. When we come across someone who has experienced similar situations to ours and who has found a way out in God, something inside us is touched. The Psalms restore because they reveal that we are not alone, that faith can coexist with fear, and that God remains accessible even in the darkest days. This spiritual legacy remains relevant today. The dilemmas faced by David and his contemporaries, although distant in time, are still repeated in new forms. Persecution has given way to exhaustion, exile has been replaced by a sense of inner displacement, but the essential pain remains the same, the longing for meaning, for shelter, for an answer. And the Psalms continue to be that shelter, not as ready-made answers, but as a safe space where we can pour out our souls without fear. In the journey of those seeking inner restoration, there comes a time when practice becomes as important as reflection. It is not enough to recognize that the Psalms have spiritual depth. It is necessary to bring them into life, incorporate them into your routine, and allow them to stop being just words read and become lived experiences. And of all the moments of the day, bedtime has proven to be one of the most powerful for this type of encounter. When night falls and the hustle and bustle of everyday life subsides, human beings find themselves face to face with themselves. Distractions cease, commitments are postponed, and silence reveals what was left unresolved over the hours. It is at this moment that many minds become noisy, reliving conflicts, doubts, and insecurities. This nocturnal vulnerability, although uncomfortable, can be transformed into a fertile space for healing, if managed well. Studies from the University of Freiburg in Germany have shown that mental content in the minutes before falling asleep directly influences the quality of rest and even the type of dreams that an individual experiences. Another study, published by the University of Chicago, demonstrated that nighttime habits related to contemplative reading and prayer contribute to reducing insomnia and feelings of tiredness upon waking. These data only confirm what many spiritual traditions have already intuited. The way we end the day profoundly shapes the state of the body and soul during rest. Reading the Psalms before bed is not a mystical ritual or an automatic gesture. It is an intentional choice to end the day in connection with what is most true. It offers the spirit a chance to breathe after the tensions of the world. Many who adopt this practice report not only more peaceful nights, but also a new perception of their own feelings, reactions, and thoughts. This happens because the psalm read in silence or whispered in prayer acts as a kind of mirror, reflecting that which we sometimes cannot name. Each verse works like a door that opens into the soul. At times, he touches on old wounds, awakening tears that had been bottled up. In others, it offers immediate comfort, as if the words had been written for that exact moment. There are no guarantees of mystical experiences or sudden revelations, but there is something even more precious: the consistency of a routine that, day after day, realigns the heart with what is essential. It is important to emphasize that this practice does not require complex preparation. It does not depend on a perfect environment or a long time. All that is needed is a sincere desire to be silent for a few minutes and allow the sacred text to have space. A psalm can be read in a few moments, but its effects extend far beyond the time spent reading. It reorganizes thoughts, eases tensions, and repositions the perspective with which one views reality. This subtle but constant renewal is what transforms the practice into a path of inner care. For many, reading the Psalms at night has become more than a habit. It became a support point. In the midst of unpredictable days, where news comes quickly and problems seem to give no respite, finding a fixed moment to reconnect with the sacred has worked as a necessary refuge, not as an escape, but as a source of sustenance. There are those who find in this reading a new courage to face the next day, or a peace that no other activity has been able to offer. The transformation that occurs in this routine is not the result of psychological suggestion or emotional conditioning. It is born from the sincere encounter between the text and the soul that welcomes it. When the Psalms are read carefully and truthfully, they become seeds. And like every seed, they need time to germinate, repetition to take root, surrender to flourish. A single reading can alleviate anguish, but it is consistency that forms a foundation. This is why the most profound effects are not revealed just on specific nights, but over weeks and months of practice. This experience also promotes an inner re-education. In a world that values immediate answers, reading the Psalms invites us to wait and embrace the process. Instead of demanding that the problem disappear, it teaches us to look at what we are feeling with compassion and faith. It is another way of living, more complete, more attentive, more profound. And this goes beyond the moment of reading. It is reflected in behavior, choices, and relationships. What begins as a simple nocturnal gesture gradually shapes the way we exist. Therefore, when you go to bed, it is not just a matter of closing your eyes to rest your body. It is about making space for your spirit to be touched by something that transcends it. The Psalms, with their ancient wisdom, continue to be effective instruments for this purpose. When integrated into your routine, especially at the end of the day, they reveal themselves as silent but powerful tools for inner reconstruction. Over time, faith and science have often been treated as opposing, almost incompatible spheres. Spirituality was seen by many as a territory of subjectivity, while science was consolidated as a field of reason and evidence. However, this antagonism began to be revised as more recent research began to explore the real effects of faith on physical and emotional health. What was once considered a matter of exclusive belief is now also the object of serious investigation in academic centers around the world. Over the past 20 years, institutions such as Harvard University, Duke University, and Johns Hopkins University have conducted studies that point to a significant relationship between religious practices and general well-being. In one of the publications from Harvard Medical School, researchers highlighted that people with regular spiritual habits had greater emotional resilience, less propensity to chronic stress, and better recovery rates in crisis situations. This is not a theological argument, but empirical data analyzed with methodological rigor. Reading sacred texts, such as the Psalms, is part of this context of practices that produce measurable impacts on health. A study conducted in 2020 by the University of California followed patients undergoing treatment for chronic diseases. Those who maintained a routine of prayer or devotional reading reported higher levels of emotional comfort, as well as a lower incidence of symptoms such as irritability and insomnia. These results reinforce the idea that spirituality can work as an ally in coping with pain, especially during prolonged periods of suffering. But what exactly happens to the body and mind when someone genuinely turns to faith? Neuroscience research suggests that spiritual meditation, when practiced regularly, activates regions of the brain linked to empathy, compassion, and self-control. At the same time, it reduces activity in areas associated with fear and overreactivity. This means that religious experience is not just symbolic consolation, but can change mental and physical patterns in concrete ways. Faith, in this sense, is revealed not as an escape from reality, but as a tool that helps to reorganize perception in the face of difficulties. It is important to remember that this type of approach is not intended to replace medical treatments. No spiritual practice should be used as a substitute for clinical care. However, what science has shown is that faith can complement this care, offering psychological and emotional support that enhances the effectiveness of conventional therapies. In patients with chronic diseases, for example, spirituality has been linked to increased adherence to treatment, reduced hospital stays, and improved quality of life. In Brazil, this integration between spirituality and health is already recognized by public institutions. In 2018, the Ministry of Health included spirituality as one of the integrative and complementary practices in the unified health system. This means that, in the context of care, it is legitimate to consider the spiritual dimension as part of the treatment. This decision was not made out of convenience, but based on accumulated evidence on the benefits of comprehensive care, which includes body, mind, and spirit. It is in this context that the Psalms gain even more relevance. Reading them frequently, especially at times of reflection such as the end of the day, offers the individual an environment of self-reflection, security, and transcendence. Unlike generic self-help texts, the Psalms contain content that spans centuries, validated not by passing theories, but by continuous experiences of faith, confrontation, and overcoming. When accessed consciously, they become stimuli that promote emotional balance and inner peace. It is no coincidence that many hospitals and clinics around the world maintain spaces dedicated to prayer, Bible reading, and spiritual listening. These spaces are not merely symbolic. They reflect the recognition that human beings need more than medicine to heal. They need meaning, they need connection, they need hope. And faith, when healthy and well-directed, offers exactly that. It does not deny suffering, but teaches us to go through it with dignity and purpose. This harmony between spirituality and science is not a recent phenomenon. It reflects a reconciliation between knowledge that, at some point in history, was separated by cultural conventions. Today, scientists themselves recognize that well-being cannot be understood solely from a biological perspective. It is also necessary to consider the emotional and spiritual dimensions which directly influence the way each person responds to life's challenges. In this context, reading the Psalms becomes a practice that combines the care of the soul with the principles of neuroscience, psychology, and medicine. By creating a space for listening, organizing emotions through words, and encouraging hope in the midst of pain, this reading actively participates in the recovery process, and it does so without demanding formulas or imposing dogmas, simply inviting presence, silence, and inner truth. When we understand the breadth of what the Psalms represent, it becomes clear that these ancient words continue to offer valid answers to extremely current dilemmas. Reading them is not a mechanical exercise, nor is it a simple repetition of verses. It is a daily choice to allow the heart to align itself with a wisdom that has survived centuries of wars, exiles, reconstructions, and new beginnings. It is this permanence that gives them authority, and that is why they still speak, still touch, still awaken echoes in those who allow themselves to listen to them. The habit of reading the Psalms, especially at the end of the day, does not magically transform external reality. What actually changes is the way in which this reality is faced. The routine remains, the challenges continue, but the perspective is renewed. Words that, at first glance, seem to be just historical records start to function as guidance, advice, consolation. Not because they carry ready-made formulas, but because they lead us to a quieter place where it is possible to reorganize thoughts and emotions with more lucidity and less weight. Over the generations, countless people have found true rest by poring over these texts. Each person, with their particular story, their baggage of experiences and their inner conflicts, found in the Psalms not only a mirror, but also a shelter. A symbolic yet real space where suffering was understood, where questions could be asked without censorship, and where faith could exist even in the midst of doubt. There is something profoundly liberating in discovering that you don't need to have all the answers to get closer to God. The Psalms do not require unshakable faith or emotional strength. They welcome the frail, the weary, the confused, the stumbling. There is no idealization of spiritual perfection in them. On the contrary, what we see is a succession of voices that expose their weaknesses and yet find meaning in remaining focused on what is eternal. Bringing this reading into your routine, especially during the quiet hours of the night, is a way of recognizing that life needs conscious pauses. Not to escape reality, but to catch your breath, redirect your gaze, and remember that there is something greater sustaining the invisible. It is at this moment that the psalm ceases to be just a text and becomes an experience. The verse read becomes a bridge to a new way of facing pain, of walking more lightly, of realizing that there is hope even when everything seems static. This is not a practice restricted to formal religious contexts. Anyone, anywhere, can open one of these psalms and allow themselves to listen more deeply. It could be in a dark room, in a hospital, in the silence of a restless dawn. The text remains the same, but the reader is no longer the same. There is something in the ritual repetition of this reading that educates sensitivity, sharpens listening, and broadens the perception that the sacred also communicates in small gestures, in minutes of recollection, in tears that flow without words. Furthermore, when science joins spirituality, as seen, the awareness that faith and reason do not need to compete for space increases. They can complement each other, support each other, and strengthen each other. Faith accesses what technology cannot reach. Science takes care of what is visible, measurable, physiological. Spirituality acts on what cannot be measured, but rather felt, the meaning of existence, the connection with the invisible, the emotional support that no statistics can predict. And together, they point to more complete paths to a balanced life, even in the face of chaos. This encounter between spirituality and knowledge has promoted a new way of looking at human beings, a perspective that understands that health is not the absence of symptoms, but the presence of meaning, and that it is not enough to treat the body if the soul remains ill. In this scenario, the Psalms emerge as instruments that speak directly to the heart, bringing comfort that goes beyond logic and healing that begins within before being reflected on the outside. At the end of a difficult day, when the noise of the world gives way to inner silence, this reading becomes even more valuable. It is at this moment that the soul finally finds space to rest. Not because all the problems were solved, but because another presence was felt. A presence that supports, that listens, that understands. And above all, this remains. The transformation that the Psalms offer is not in promises of ease, but in the construction of a strength that arises from the encounter with what is eternal. Perhaps the most surprising thing about this silent practice of surrendering to these ancient verses is realizing that even in times of such haste and distraction, there is still power in words that penetrate the soul. And perhaps, by repeating a psalm before going to sleep, you will not only find rest for your body, but also discover something that goes beyond, the certainty that you are not alone. And this certainty, in itself, is already a form of healing. If you enjoyed the content and want to support our work so that we can continue to bring you more in-depth research and analysis, please consider making a donation of any amount. This contribution directly helps in the growth of the channel and in the production of even richer materials. Thank you very much for your support.